Every neighborhood seems to attract at least one person who cannot live without control. Sometimes it's a board member who thrives on nitpicking fences and flower beds. Other times it's a self-appointed guardian, a person who mistakes nosiness for duty. In our neighborhood, that person was Craig Pritchard, a man who wanted authority so badly that he built a fantasy around it. Craig was not elected to the HOA board, though he had campaigned for a seat more than once. His name never carried enough support, mostly because people found him abrasive. He wasn't friendly, he wasn't approachable, and he never seemed interested in collaboration. Instead, Craig carried himself as though he already had power, as though the rest of us were simply too slow to recognize it. What made Craig stand out was his uniform, or rather the uniform he created for himself. He purchased a cheap tactical vest online, the kind with Velcro straps and oversized pockets, and wore it proudly as though it gave him legal standing. Mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes, which only made his demeanor more unsettling. A walkie-talkie clipped to his belt completed the look, though it was rarely turned on. To him, these props transformed him into something he wasn't, an enforcer. Craig would patrol the streets, clipboard in hand, scribbling notes about lawns he thought were overgrown, cars parked too close to curbs, or trash bins left out too long. He issued citations on scraps of printer paper, sliding them under windshield wipers as though they carried real weight. He stopped joggers to lecture them about fitness safety ordinances he had invented. Children riding bikes were scolded for reckless cycling. Delivery drivers were harassed for blocking driveways, even for a moment. At first, neighbors laughed him off. His tickets were thrown away, his warnings ignored. But Craig thrived on attention, and ignoring him only seemed to encourage escalation. He began calling himself Neighborhood Watch Captain, though no such program existed. He bragged about working closely with the HOA, though board members rolled their eyes when asked. He even hinted that he was connected with local law enforcement, a claim no one believed, but which unsettled people nonetheless. For me, Craig had always been an annoyance, but nothing more. He lingered too long near driveways, shouted too loudly at kids, and strutted around like a security guard at a mall no one had asked him to protect. My wife called him Officer Craig, sarcastically, a nickname that stuck among a few neighbors. But no one expected him to be dangerous. All of that changed on a warm Saturday afternoon in late spring. My son Luke had just turned 16. Like many teenagers, he was eager for independence, and his used sedan had become his pride and joy. It wasn't much to look at, an old model with faded paint, but to Luke, it represented freedom. We had spent months working on it together in the garage, replacing parts, buffing out scratches, and coaxing the engine back to life. That car wasn't just transportation. It was a bond between father and son. On that afternoon, Luke rolled it into the driveway for a wash. The sun shone brightly, music played from a small Bluetooth speaker, and suds slid down the hood as he worked methodically. His face carried the kind of focus only a teenager can have when caring for something they truly treasure. I watched from the kitchen window with a quiet smile, content to let him enjoy the moment. Then Craig appeared. I spotted him striding down the sidewalk in his usual getup, the vest, the sunglasses, the walkie-talkie bouncing at his side. His chest was puffed out, his chin tilted high, his arms swinging with exaggerated authority. He stopped abruptly at the edge of our property, hands planted on his hips, staring at Luke like a cop about to issue a citation. At first, Luke didn't notice. He was too absorbed in scrubbing the wheels, humming along with the music. But Craig's voice soon cut through the air, sharp and commanding. Though I couldn't hear every word from inside, phrases carried on the breeze. Not allowed. Ordinance violation. Reporting you. Luke straightened, confusion on his face. He muttered something, likely brushing Craig off, but Craig's tone grew louder, more aggressive. He jabbed a finger toward the car, then toward Luke, his gestures stiff and accusatory. Neighbors began peeking from their porches, curious about the commotion. I frowned, wiping my hands and moving toward the door. Confrontations with Craig were never pleasant, but I assumed it would be another lecture about community rules. I had no idea that this time would be different, because Craig's hand moved. In one motion, He reached to the side of his vest and pulled out a handgun. The glint of metal in the sunlight froze me where I stood. My breath caught in my throat as my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. Craig wasn't waving a toy or some harmless prop. This was a firearm, real and unmistakable. He pointed it in Luke's direction. My son stood frozen, soap dripping from the sponge in his hand, water pooling around his sneakers. His face drained of color, eyes locked on the weapon aimed at him. He didn't move, didn't speak. He was paralyzed by the sudden, incomprehensible threat. I burst through the door, adrenaline surging, my voice cracking as I shouted for Craig to stop. Neighbors gasped and shouted as well, some ducking behind fences, others pulling out phones to record or call 911. A wave of panic rippled through the street, the kind of collective disbelief that something so absurd could actually be happening in front of them. Craig barked words I couldn't fully make out, his arm stiff, his finger twitching near the trigger. He accused Luke of some imagined crime, maybe trespassing, maybe vandalism, maybe nothing at all. His voice cracked with fury, but underneath it I could hear something else. Fear, because Craig's fantasy had finally collided with reality. He had spent years pretending to be an authority figure, but now he had escalated into dangerous territory. Surrounded by witnesses, cell phone cameras pointed at him, neighbors screaming for police. He had nowhere to hide, and then came the sound that shattered his illusion entirely. The distant wail of sirens. The real police were on their way. Craig's bravado faltered. His grip on the weapon trembled, his sunglasses hiding whatever panic filled his eyes. The swagger was gone, replaced by the twitching uncertainty of a man who had taken his game too far. He shifted his weight, glancing around as though searching for an escape, but the neighborhood had closed in. Every driveway, every porch, every pair of eyes was on him. Luke still stood frozen, but the sirens gave me just enough clarity to act. I moved closer slowly, shouting for my son to step back, to move. When the flashing lights rolled into the neighborhood, it felt like the entire street exhaled at once. The air had been thick with tension, a string pulled so taut that the slightest tug might have snapped it. And then, with the sharp wail of sirens and the crunch of patrol car tires, the power shifted. Craig's grip on his gun faltered. Only moments before, he had stood tall in his tactical vest, barking orders, trying to project the illusion of control. Now he looked small, unsteady, his bluster crumbling under the weight of the real law. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths as the officers fanned out, shouting commands that carried the unmistakable authority his fake citations never could. My son Luke, still frozen in place, seemed to come alive only when one of the officers shouted for him to move back. His sponge clattered to the driveway as he stumbled toward me, his eyes wide, his face pale. I threw an arm around his shoulders, pulling him close, my own heart pounding with equal parts relief and rage. The officers closed in on Craig. Their movements were sharp, efficient, rehearsed. Guns trained, voices firm, they demanded he drop his weapon. For a moment, it seemed Craig might resist. His jaw tightened, his stance widened, as though some part of him still clung to the fantasy that he was one of them. But reality struck hard. The sight of half a dozen trained officers pointing weapons at him shattered the last fragments of his delusion. The gun clattered to the pavement. Officers rushed forward, pinning Craig against the hood of a patrol car, his arms yanked behind his back. The mirrored sunglasses slipped from his face and fell to the ground, revealing wide, frantic eyes that darted from neighbor to neighbor, searching for sympathy and finding none. The tactical vest that had once made him feel powerful now looked ridiculous, almost childlike, as real lawmen stripped it off and tossed it aside. The street was alive with murmurs, whispers, and the faint hum of recording phones. Neighbors who had once shrugged off Craig's antics as harmless now stared in disbelief at the man in handcuffs. Some shook their heads, others muttered angrily, and a few simply watched in stunned silence. The myth of Officer Craig had collapsed in real time, and everyone had witnessed it. As Craig was guided into the back of the patrol car, he began protesting. His voice cracked as he shouted about community safety and standing his ground, but the officers ignored him. His words sounded hollow, frantic, more like excuses than explanations. The car door slammed shut, muffling his voice, and just like that, the man who had patrolled our streets with imaginary authority was reduced to a detainee in the back seat. The officers turned their attention to us, the witnesses, the bystanders, the victims. Questions came quickly, efficiently. Did we see the gun? Did we hear threats? How close had Craig come to pulling the trigger? Every detail mattered, and though my hands still trembled, I forced myself to answer clearly. Luke stood beside me, silent, his eyes fixed on the ground, his knuckles white as he gripped his own arms. I could feel the weight of his fear. 16 years old, confronted with a gun by a man who had no right to wield it. That kind of moment doesn't fade easily. It carves itself into memory, a scar that lingers long after the danger passes. Neighbors provided their own accounts. Phones were handed over, videos replayed, timelines clarified. The officers took notes, nodded, and exchanged glances that spoke volumes. This wasn't just a disturbance. It was a serious crime. Craig hadn't just embarrassed himself. He had crossed a line that carried heavy consequences. When the questions ended, and the officers assured us Craig would be processed at the station, a different kind of tension settled over the street. Relief, yes, but also unease. We had lived alongside this man for years, endured his posturing, his fake authority, his petty harassment. And while we had dismissed him as little more than a nuisance, today proved how wrong we had been. Craig wasn't harmless. He was dangerous. As the patrol cars pulled away, taking Craig with them, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath again. Conversations broke out in small clusters, neighbors comparing stories, speculating about what would happen next. Some were outraged that it had taken so long for his behavior to escalate to this point. Others worried about the fallout, about what Craig might do if he returned. I walked Luke inside, guiding him to the couch. His hands still shook, his breathing uneven. My wife rushed to his side, wrapping him in an embrace that he didn't resist. For once, he didn't shrug away from her worry. He leaned into it, exhausted by the weight of what had just happened. That night, the neighborhood group chat exploded. Videos of the incident circulated, comments flew, and emotions ran high. Words like unbelievable, unacceptable, and thank God the cops came filled the screen. Some neighbors admitted they had always feared Craig would snap. Others confessed they had laughed off his antics for too long. One message stood out among the flood. A neighbor claiming Craig had once hinted at carrying for protection during an argument about kids riding scooters. No one had taken it seriously then. Now, the chilling significance of that memory hung heavy in the chat. Sleep was elusive that night. Every creak of the house made me tense. Every shadow outside the window made me wonder. Even though Craig was behind bars, the idea of him, of what he had done, lingered in the dark corners of my mind. I checked the locks twice, then a third time, before finally collapsing into uneasy rest. Morning brought news. Craig had been booked for brandishing a firearm, making threats, and impersonating an officer. The impersonation charge stemmed from his vest, his fake citations, and the way he had introduced himself to police. In the past, as neighborhood watch captain, it turned out that wasn't just a harmless nickname he gave himself. He had filed bogus complaints with law enforcement under that title, trying to bolster his image. The neighborhood buzzed with updates, speculation, and debate. Some wondered if Craig would face jail time. Others doubted it, predicting a slap on the wrist. What everyone agreed on, though, was that trust had been shattered. How could we ever feel safe with him living among us again? But the story didn't end with Craig's arrest. If anything, that moment was only the beginning, because Craig's family, embarrassed and defensive, began pushing back. His wife insisted he was misunderstood, that he had only been protecting the neighborhood. A cousin claimed Craig was being framed by neighbors who never liked him. And then, astonishingly, a small group of supporters emerged. People who argued online that Craig had been within his rights, that the real threat was the lack of order in the community. Lines were drawn. The neighborhood began to fracture, not just around Craig's actions, but around the question of authority itself. Who gets to enforce the rules? What happens when the HOA fails to act? And what do neighbors owe one another when safety is at stake? For me, the answers were clear. Craig had endangered my son. He had crossed a line no one should cross. and I wasn't about to let the neighborhood forget it. But as the days passed, it became obvious that Craig's shadow loomed larger than ever, even from behind bars. Rumors swirled that he might post bail, that he might come back before the trial. Some neighbors whispered about moving away, unwilling to risk another confrontation. Others talked about forming a real neighborhood watch, one sanctioned and accountable to ensure nothing like this happened again. Through it all, Luke grew quieter. His once carefree demeanor dimmed, his laughter less frequent. The car he had once been so proud of sat untouched in the driveway, soap stains still marking where he had dropped the sponge. Every time he looked at it, I could see the memory flicker in his eyes, the barrel of Craig's gun, the frozen terror, the sound of sirens. That was when I realized the battle wasn't just about Craig anymore. It was about healing, about reclaiming the sense of safety he had stolen from us. And it was only just beginning. The neighborhood might have slept easier if Craig had remained in custody. For a brief moment, it felt as though the system had done what we all had hoped, removed a danger from our streets, and restored peace. But peace is fragile, and it shattered faster than anyone expected. It started with whispers. On the second morning after Craig's arrest, the group chat lit up again, not with updates from police, but with rumors. One neighbor claimed to have seen Craig's wife outside the courthouse. Another said a cousin had posted online about supporting Craig during his hearing. By midday, the whispers grew louder. Craig was posting bail. The confirmation came just after dinner. My phone buzzed with a message that froze my stomach. Craig had been released pending trial. He was coming home. The news spread like wildfire. Within an hour, clusters of neighbors gathered on sidewalks, voices raised in disbelief and anger. How could the court let him walk free after pointing a gun at a teenager? What guarantee did we have that he wouldn't do it again? Fear and frustration mingled in equal measure, a heavy fog that settled over every conversation. That night, I barely slept. My son Luke didn't sleep at all. I could hear him pacing his room, the floor creaking with every step. His car remained untouched, the once proud symbol of independence now a monument to trauma. I wanted to promise him safety, to assure him Craig wouldn't dare show his face again. But promises like that felt hollow when the law itself had already failed us. The following afternoon, Craig returned. I happened to be outside when his wife's SUV pulled into their driveway. Neighbors peeked from windows, blinds shifting like watchful eyes. The passenger door opened and Craig stepped out. Gone was the swagger of a self-styled enforcer. His face looked pale, drawn, his hair unkempt. But even stripped of confidence, his presence carried weight. He was back, and the neighborhood felt smaller because of it. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, hurrying inside with groceries or pulling children closer. Others stood frozen, openly staring as if to confirm this wasn't some mistake. Craig ignored them all. He didn't glance toward my house, didn't acknowledge the whispers. He simply walked inside, his shoulders tense, his wife trailing close behind. But if Craig thought he could fade quietly back into routine, he was wrong. His return ignited the kind of outrage that simmers into action. The HOA board, normally sluggish and bureaucratic, convened an emergency meeting. Flyers appeared on doorsteps within hours, announcing a discussion about recent safety concerns. The wording was vague, but everyone knew what it meant. By the time the meeting began, the clubhouse was packed wall to wall with residents, faces tight with anger, fear, and determination. I stood among them, Luke at home under his mother's watchful eye. Conversations buzzed in every corner. Some neighbors demanded immediate action. Petitions to bar Craig from common spaces, security patrols, even temporary relocation assistance for families too shaken to stay. Others voiced hesitation, worried about legal limits, about stirring further conflict. But the consensus was clear. Something had to be done. When the board president finally spoke, her voice wavered with nerves. She admitted the HOA had ignored complaints about Craig for too long, dismissing him as a nuisance instead of recognizing the danger. Now, with an armed confrontation on record, the neighborhood had reached a breaking point. The board promised to explore every legal option, from restraining orders to civil suits. Applause rippled through the crowd, though it was tinged with frustration that it had taken so long. I left that meeting with mixed emotions. Relief that others finally saw Craig as the threat he was, but unease about how far he might push back. Because one thing was certain, Craig didn't see himself as guilty. To him, he was a victim of misunderstanding, a hero wrongly punished. And men like that don't retreat quietly. The days that followed proved me right. Craig re-emerged on the streets, not with a gun this time, but with a chip on his shoulder. He walked briskly to his mailbox, head high, ignoring the stares of neighbors. He mowed his lawn with mechanical precision, as if daring anyone to comment. He even lingered near the sidewalk where Luke had washed his car, standing still for long moments before retreating back inside. His presence was a silent provocation, a reminder that he was still here, still watching. Then came the flyers. One morning, folded sheets of paper appeared on doorsteps. They bore Craig's name at the top, followed by paragraphs of rambling text about neighborhood safety, false accusations, and community loyalty. He accused neighbors of conspiring against him, of twisting events to paint him as a villain. He insisted he had acted in self-defense, that he had only brandished his firearm to protect himself from aggressive behavior. The irony was nauseating. My 16-year-old son, frozen with a sponge in his hand, was hardly a threat. But Craig's narrative wasn't about truth, it was about reclaiming control. Some neighbors tore the flyers up immediately. Others saved them as evidence. A few, just a few, whispered that maybe Craig had a point, that perhaps things weren't as black and white as they seemed. And that sliver of doubt was all Craig needed to exploit. Because Craig had supporters, however few. A retired neighbor who disliked teenagers, a couple who believed strongly in gun rights, a man who felt the HOA had too much power and sympathized with Craig's defiance. They weren't the majority, but they gave Craig a foothold, a platform from which to argue he wasn't alone. The neighborhood split. Lines were drawn not just in group chats, but in real life. Some houses sported yard signs demanding justice for Luke or keep our kids safe. Others remained neutral, blinds closed tight, unwilling to take a side. And a small but vocal handful echoed Craig's rhetoric about overreach and character assassination. Tension grew unbearable. Passing cars slowed when Craig was outside. Parents clutched children tighter at the park. Conversations hushed whenever he walked by. It felt like living in a powder keg, the fuse already lit, sparks inching closer each day. Meanwhile, the legal process crawled forward. Craig's hearing loomed on the calendar, but the wheels of justice turned slowly. Court dates were set, then delayed. Lawyers argued over details. In the meantime, Craig lived freely among us, his very existence a daily reminder of what had happened. Luke struggled most of all. Nights were restless, mornings heavy with dread. He avoided his car entirely, walking to school or catching rides with friends instead. His laughter, once effortless, now seemed rare, pulled from him only in fleeting moments. Watching him withdraw broke something in me. A father can fix a scraped knee, repair a broken toy, even patch up an old sedan. But he can't erase the memory of a gun pointed at his child. And then came the night that proved the neighborhood's fears were far from over. It was late, the streets quiet, when headlights swept across our living room curtains. I stepped outside to find Craig's SUV idling near my driveway. He wasn't inside, at least not visibly, but the vehicle sat there for long minutes, engine humming, before pulling away. The next morning, fresh tire marks lined the curb. Luke saw them first. His face drained of color, and he muttered something about Craig keeping watch. The look in his eyes told me everything. Fear had become a constant, living shadow. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a matter for the courts. This was a battle for our neighborhood's soul, and Craig wasn't finished fighting. Craig's SUV wasn't the last vehicle to idle near my home. Over the next week, headlights swept across our curtains on 3 separate nights. Each time, by the time I rose from bed and looked outside, the car would already be pulling away. Sometimes it was Craig's. Other times it was unmarked, an old pickup, a sedan with tinted windows. The uncertainty only deepened the unease. Neighbors noticed too. One family down the street reported late-night knocks at their door, but when they opened it, no one was there. Another claimed they saw Craig walking the block at midnight, flashlight in hand as if conducting patrols. Whether true or exaggerated, the stories spread quickly, feeding the growing paranoia. The HOA board scrambled to respond. They sent out lengthy emails promising to ensure community safety and pursue legal remedies. But words felt like smoke, thin, insubstantial, and unable to stop the gnawing fear. Parents escorted their children in pairs. Joggers switched to daylight runs. Porch lights that once went off after midnight now burned until dawn. Craig, however, seemed emboldened. One afternoon, I caught him standing at the edge of my property line. He wasn't trespassing, not technically, but he lingered just long enough to make the message clear. He wasn't afraid of me or anyone else. His eyes flicked toward Luke's car, still untouched in the driveway, and for a moment his lips curled into something that might have been a smirk. Then he turned and walked away, slow and deliberate. Luke saw it too. He had been sitting on the porch, earbuds in, trying to distract himself with music. The color drained from his face as soon as he recognized Craig, and he bolted inside without a word. I wanted to chase Craig down, to shout, to demand he leave us alone. But I knew that was exactly what he wanted. Confrontation fed his illusion of authority. Silence, restraint, and evidence were our only weapons, but silence doesn't erase fear, and evidence doesn't ease sleepless nights. The neighborhood fractures widened. On one side, the majority demanded protection, petitioning the HOA and local authorities for stronger action. On the other side, Craig's handful of supporters dug in, framing the issue as a witch hunt. They claimed Craig had been unfairly targeted, that he was simply exercising his rights, that neighbors were blowing things out of proportion. At first, their voices were small, but social media amplified them. Comments appeared on local forums, anonymous posts questioning whether Craig had really threatened anyone, suggesting maybe Luke had exaggerated. Some even accused the HOA board of fabricating danger to tighten control. Lies spread faster than truth, and each one landed like a fresh wound. Luke read them all. Despite our efforts to shield him, he scrolled late into the night, eyes locked on the glowing screen. Every cruel comment, every dismissive remark chipped away at him. It wasn't enough that he had nearly been shot. Now he had to defend the validity of his fear. He grew quieter, his shoulders slumping beneath invisible weight. And I grew angrier. One evening, after yet another SUV idled near our driveway, I confronted the board directly. I demanded they do more. File restraining orders, hire security, anything to make Craig understand he wasn't untouchable. The board president listened, nodding solemnly, but her response was cautious. Legal processes took time, she reminded me. Retaliation was a risk. The board couldn't act recklessly. Reckless, I thought bitterly. Was pulling a gun on a teenager. But the board wasn't the only one calculating. Craig escalated further, this time targeting the neighborhood itself. Anonymous letters began appearing in mailboxes. They carried no signatures, but their tone was unmistakably his. They accused the HOA of corruption, neighbors of betrayal, and me specifically of orchestrating lies to control the narrative. My name was written in bold, underlined, as though I were some villain in his conspiracy. Some neighbors tossed the letters without reading. Others saved them for police reports. But a few whispered doubts, and doubt was all Craig needed to keep his grip on the neighborhood. Then came the night of the siren. It was past midnight when the wail pierced the quiet. Red and blue lights flashed outside, and I stumbled out of bed, heart pounding. Police cars lined the street, officers moving briskly between houses. Word spread quickly. Someone had reported a break-in. The victim? A family 2 doors down. They had awoken to find their back gate ajar and their garage door wide open. Nothing had been stolen, but tools were scattered across the lawn, as if someone had rummaged through them before fleeing. The police treated it seriously, combing the area, questioning neighbors. And then a rumor spread like fire. Craig had been spotted nearby. A neighbor swore they saw his SUV idling near the alley half an hour before the incident. Another claimed they heard footsteps that matched his heavy stride. No one could prove it, but suspicion was enough. The break-in became another shadow in Craig's growing reputation, another stain on an already fractured community. The next morning, Craig's SUV was parked boldly in his driveway, as if mocking us. He stood outside with a coffee mug in hand, watching as neighbors walked past with wary eyes. His posture screamed defiance. The HOA convened again, this time under heavier pressure. The break-in had tipped the scales. Neighbors demanded action, signatures filled petitions, and calls to law enforcement increased. The board promised to seek a restraining order not just for me and Luke, but for the neighborhood at large. It was a step forward, but steps feel small when danger feels so close. Luke refused to leave the house alone. His car gathered dust, weeds curling near its tires. His once bright spirit dimmed further each day, and I felt helpless to restore it. But Craig wasn't finished, not by a long shot. 2 weeks later, flyers reappeared. Not the rambling manifestos of before, but bold, professional-looking sheets plastered on light poles and mailboxes. They accused the HOA of tyranny, neighbors of cowardice, and me of leading a smear campaign. At the bottom was a phone number for residents who supported neighborhood freedom. It was unmistakably Craig's work. The flyers sparked another round of debates, arguments, and division. Supporters claimed he was exercising free speech. Opponents called it harassment. The tension reached boiling point during another HOA meeting when voices rose, fists pounded tables, and one man stormed out, shouting that he wouldn't be silenced. The neighborhood was tearing itself apart, and Craig stood at the center, feeding on the chaos. That night, I sat awake in the living room, lights off, staring at the quiet street. The shadows seemed longer, darker, every passing car a potential threat. I realized then that this wasn't just about one man with delusions of authority. This was about a community unraveling under the weight of fear, manipulation, and mistrust. Craig had turned neighbors against each other. He had made us doubt, argue, and scatter. And until someone stopped him, he would keep pressing, keep escalating, keep eroding the fabric of the place we once called safe. And then came the breaking point. Late one evening, just as Luke was settling into uneasy sleep, the sound of shattering glass cut through the night. A rock had been hurled through our front window, scattering shards across the floor. Luke screamed, my wife gasped, and I lunged for the door, but the street outside was empty, silent, mocking. On the rock was a scrap of paper taped crudely. 3 words scrawled in bold letters: liar, fraud, enemy. The police came, took reports, shook their heads. The shattered glass lingered longer in memory than in the carpet. Even after the window was boarded up and the shards swept away, the sound replayed in my head each night, sharp, sudden, final. It was no longer a matter of speculation about Craig's capacity for escalation. The line between intimidation and outright violence had been crossed, and the air of the neighborhood thickened with dread. Luke hadn't slept properly since. His bed became a place of vigilance rather than rest. He kept the blinds drawn, his phone clutched in his hand, flashlight app open as if he might need it at any moment. When he finally drifted into short bursts of sleep, he woke drenched in sweat, heart racing. He avoided the front rooms altogether, choosing instead to retreat deeper into the house, away from the broken window that reminded him of just how vulnerable we had become. I tried to be strong for him, but strength is a fragile mask. Beneath it, frustration gnawed at me. Anger coiled in my chest like a spring pulled tighter each day. The police had filed reports, noted the incident, promised extra patrols, but promises felt like paper shields. And still, Craig roamed free, sipping coffee on his porch in the mornings, walking with infuriating confidence past the very houses that whispered his name with fear. The HOA board faced growing unrest. The community had reached a breaking point. Meetings that once revolved around lawn care and dues now stretched for hours, with voices rising in anger, fear, and despair. Some residents threatened to sell their homes and leave altogether. Others demanded drastic action, calling for private security or collective legal suits. The board members, their faces lined with exhaustion, struggled to maintain order. It wasn't just about Craig anymore. It was about what he represented: chaos, division, and the unraveling of trust. In the days after the rock through our window, Craig doubled down on his tactics. More anonymous flyers appeared, this time slipped under doors and wedged into car windshields. They contained rambling accusations about corruption, lies, and conspiracies, painting Craig as a hero under siege. But they also contained veiled threats, phrases about traitors being exposed and liars facing consequences. No names were mentioned, but everyone knew who he meant. Then came the night patrols. Craig began walking the neighborhood openly after dark. Flashlight in hand, phone raised as if recording. He wore a reflective vest like some official officer, pacing deliberately past each house. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, too afraid to confront him directly, but his presence weighed on us all. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was flaunting his power, daring someone to stop him. The police were called multiple times, but each time, Craig walked away unbothered. He knew the boundaries of the law well enough to dance on their edges without crossing outright. Trespassing required stepping onto private property. Harassment required more than just walking with a flashlight. He operated in the gray areas, exploiting the gaps where fear thrived. For Luke, it was unbearable. He stopped going outside entirely, his car gathering dust, his once bright demeanor fading into shadows. He spent his time in the basement, headphones clamped tight, trying to drown out reality with music and games. But no volume could mute the sound of Craig's heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel outside, or the occasional beam of light cutting across our blinds at midnight. The neighborhood felt like it was under siege. One evening, during yet another heated HOA meeting, the board announced they had finally filed for a restraining order. It was a small victory, a step toward accountability, but everyone knew it wouldn't be immediate. Legal wheels turned slowly, and Craig had mastered the art of delay. He would contest it, appeal it, drag it through every bureaucratic channel until weeks or months had passed. In the meantime, the board decided to hire a private security patrol for the weekends. It was a desperate measure, funded by emergency dues, and even then, half the neighborhood argued over the cost. But fear outweighed wallets. People wanted someone, anyone, to stand watch when Craig prowled the streets. The first weekend with security brought a fragile sense of relief. A uniformed guard cruised the block in a marked car, headlights sweeping the same streets Craig once claimed as his own. But even that victory soured quickly. On the second night, the guard confronted Craig near the park entrance. Craig, wearing his reflective vest, refused to leave. He claimed he was a resident volunteer, authorized to protect the neighborhood. Witnesses described the exchange as tense, with Craig's voice rising, finger jabbing, his chest puffed in defiance. The guard, bound by limited authority, could only warn him before calling the police. By the time officers arrived, Craig had vanished. The incident only emboldened him further. A few nights later, someone spray-painted the word traitor across the HOA clubhouse wall. The paint dripped in long red streaks, grotesque in its suggestion. No one saw who did it, but suspicion didn't need proof. Craig's SUV had been spotted circling the area an hour earlier. Neighbors woke to the sight with horror. Children were hurried past it on their way to school, eyes shielded from the violent word. The board had it scrubbed clean within a day, but the damage was done. The message was clear. Luke reached his lowest point then. He confessed quietly that he felt responsible. He believed Craig's obsession with him had dragged the whole neighborhood into chaos. Tears welled in his eyes as he apologized over and over for something that was never his fault. Watching him crumble under guilt and fear lit a fire inside me. I swore silently that Craig would not break my son. But the breaking point wasn't ours. It was the neighborhood's. The tension exploded during a town hall meeting arranged with local officials. Residents packed the community center, their voices clashing like storm waves. Some shouted for Craig's immediate arrest, waving copies of the restraining order paperwork as if it were a shield. Others, his dwindling but stubborn supporters, argued for due process, painting him as a victim of mob persecution. The room grew hotter, louder, more volatile. At one point, two men nearly came to blows, held back only by the desperate hands of their wives. Children cried in the back rows, overwhelmed by the chaos. The officials sat stiffly at the front, faces pale, clearly unprepared for the boiling anger of a community pushed too far. And then, as if summoned by the fury itself, Craig appeared. He strode into the meeting hall uninvited, reflective vest gleaming, phone raised high to record. The room fell into stunned silence before erupting into shouts. People demanded he leave, fingers pointing, voices trembling with rage and fear. Craig only smiled, a smug curve of his lips that stoked the fire further. He declared himself the true protector of the neighborhood, accused the board of corruption, and claimed I had fabricated everything for personal gain. His words echoed off the walls, each one more unhinged than the last. The officials tried to restore order, but the room had already fractured. Some shouted him down, others shouted back in his defense, and the chaos spilled into the aisles. Chairs scraped, papers flew, and for a moment, I thought fists would fly. Police were called once more, and when they arrived, the week leading up to the restraining order hearing was the longest of my life. Each day stretched thin with tension, each night broken by the haunting sound of imagined footsteps outside. Luke counted the days like a prisoner scratching marks into a wall. The neighborhood watched too, every eye fixed on the calendar, waiting for justice to finally catch up with the man who had turned our quiet streets into a battleground. But Craig didn't retreat as the hearing drew closer. Instead, he grew louder. His rants online multiplied, desperate walls of text filled with accusations, conspiracies, and self-declarations of authority. He recorded rambling videos in his driveway, pacing back and forth, reflective vest zipped tight, waving papers that he insisted proved his authority. His followers, those few stubborn believers, shared his content as though it were gospel. To them, he was a whistleblower, a hero being silenced by corrupt forces. To the rest of us, he was a ticking time bomb. The night before the hearing, he staged his boldest stunt yet. Around midnight, headlights swept across the cul-de-sac, and the rumble of his SUV filled the air. Neighbors peeked from windows to see Craig circling the block slowly like a predator stalking prey. Then, suddenly, he stopped in front of our house. My heart hammered in my chest as I pulled Luke back from the curtains. We watched in silence as Craig stepped out of his vehicle, armed with nothing but a bullhorn and his ever-present phone. He raised the bullhorn to his mouth and unleashed a stream of rhetoric into the night air. He called me a liar. He called the HOA corrupt. He called Luke dangerous, a threat to the community. His voice echoed down the street, bouncing off houses where children were trying to sleep, where families huddled in fear. Dogs barked. Lights flicked on, and soon half the neighborhood stood at their windows, staring in disbelief. Police were called, of course. When they arrived, Craig tried to stand his ground, shouting about constitutional rights and illegal persecution. But the officers had little patience left. They confiscated the bullhorn, issued him a citation for disturbing the peace, and ordered him to leave immediately. Craig complied, but not without one final promise shouted over his shoulder, that the truth would be revealed in court, and we would all regret doubting him. By morning, the neighborhood buzzed with exhaustion. Parents walked their kids to school with bleary eyes. Neighbors exchanged weary nods. The hearing couldn't come soon enough. The courthouse stood stark against the gray sky the next day. I arrived with Luke at my side, both of us dressed in quiet determination. The HOA board members filed in too, their faces pale but resolute. Other neighbors came as well, eager to see the man who had haunted them finally face some measure of accountability. Craig entered last. He wore the same mirrored sunglasses he always had, the same reflective vest, as though clinging to the costume of authority he had built for himself. But beneath the bravado, cracks showed. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled through his papers, his lips moved silently as if rehearsing. The judge presiding over the case was a stern, no-nonsense figure who wasted no time. The hearing began with testimony from the board, from residents, and finally, from me. I recounted every incident. The confrontation with Luke, the gun drawn in our driveway, the midnight patrols, the shattered window. As I spoke, Craig sat rigid, jaw clenched, scribbling furiously in his notebook. Luke's testimony was the hardest to hear. His voice wavered as he described the fear he felt, the sleepless nights, the guilt that ate away at him. The room fell silent as his words painted the image of a boy stripped of his safety by a man's obsession. Even the judge's expression softened for a brief moment. Then it was Craig's turn. He rose, straightened his vest, and launched into a tirade. He called the board corrupt, accused me of fabricating evidence, claimed Luke had been reckless and dangerous. He presented his flyers as evidence of community duty, his videos as proof of his vigilance. He even waved a printout of his so-called authority papers, which were nothing more than self-written documents stamped with meaningless seals. The judge let him speak, but only for so long. When Craig veered into wild accusations about conspiracies and shadow governments, the gavel struck firmly. Order was restored, and the room exhaled. After hours of testimony, cross-examination, and deliberation, the ruling was delivered. The restraining order was granted in full. Craig was forbidden from approaching me, Luke, or any HOA property. He was banned from conducting any so-called patrols or distributing threatening flyers. The judge's words were sharp, final, and left no room for misinterpretation. For the first time, Craig's mask slipped. His face paled, his shoulders slumped. He tried to argue, but the gavel silenced him again. The ruling stood. As deputies escorted him from the courtroom, his voice rose in one last outburst. He shouted that this wasn't over, that the truth would come out, that we had silenced a protector. But the words rang hollow now, desperate echoes of a man whose stage had been dismantled. The days that followed brought a fragile peace to the neighborhood. Patrol cars cruised occasionally, ensuring the order was respected. Flyers disappeared. Windows stayed intact, and nights passed without the crunch of Craig's boots outside. Slowly, residents began to breathe again. Children returned to their bikes, parents lingered on porches, conversations drifted back to ordinary matters. Luke started sleeping again. His shoulders lightened, his laughter returned in small bursts, hesitant at first, then stronger. He washed his car one Saturday afternoon, soap bubbles glistening in the sunlight just as they had the day Craig first